The water was still dripping from her hair when Elizabeth Morrison realized the smell was all wrong. She stood there in the center of Riverside High's courtyard, soaked to the bone, while 30 kids laughed and recorded on their phones. But Lizzie wasn't thinking about the humiliation, or the way her new jeans clung to her legs, or even how Christopher Brooks stood there with that fire hose in his hands, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. No, she was thinking about the metallic tang in the air, the way the water had a faint shimmer to it that shouldn't be there, and why the little device in her backpack was beeping frantically against her spine. That device had been her grandfather's. Arthur Morrison, former mine safety inspector, had used it to detect methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, the gases that killed miners when they couldn't see them coming. Before he died, he'd pressed it into her 12-year-old hands and said, "Lizzie girl, the most dangerous things in this world are the ones you can't see, but if you know how to look, you can save lives." Right now, it was screaming, and let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories travel. Whether you're here for the action, the heart, or both, thank you for being part of this mission. Look at the little scientist girl now. Christopher's voice cut through the laughter. He was tall for 17, broad-shouldered like his father, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about anything. His friends flanked him on either side, Mason Turner and Derek Walsh, both wearing the same smirk that said they owned this place and everyone in it. Lizzie didn't respond. She was too busy calculating the water pressure, the trajectory, where Christopher had been standing when he'd aimed that hose. Most importantly, where the water had come from. The outdoor spigot was connected to the school's main system, which drew from the same aquifer that fed half the town. If there was contamination here, I said, "Look at you now." Christopher stepped closer, his voice harder. "Not so smart anymore, are you?" That's when Lizzie looked up, really looked at him, and what she saw wasn't just a bully. It was fear, raw, desperate fear hiding behind anger, the kind that came from knowing something terrible and having no idea what to do about it. She'd seen that look before, in her father's eyes, 3 months ago, when he'd walked into their kitchen in Pennsylvania and said, "Pack your bags, we're leaving." When she'd asked why, he'd just shaken his head and said, "Because I couldn't stay quiet anymore." David Morrison had been a chemical engineer for 15 years, working for companies across the industrial belt. Good companies, he'd thought, companies that followed regulations, that cared about safety, until the day he'd discovered the leak at Monarch Chemical. Benzene seeping into the groundwater. His supervisors had handed him falsified test results and told him to sign off on them. When he'd refused, they'd made sure he'd never work in the industry again. Now, here they were in Riverside, Texas, population 8,000, living in a rental house that smelled like mildew because it was all they could afford. Her father worked construction now, his engineering degree worthless thanks to the blacklist. Her mother took double shifts at the diner. And Lizzie, who'd been planning to study at MIT, was trying to survive her senior year at a school where she knew exactly no one. Until today, when she'd become everyone's entertainment. "You know what I think?" Christopher was still talking, playing to his audience. "I think you're one of those girls who thinks she's better than everyone else. Am I right? You think because you're from some fancy Pennsylvania school, you can just waltz in here and act all superior." The crowd murmured agreement. Lizzie recognized some faces from her classes. There was Sarah Chen from AP Chemistry, who'd seemed friendly enough until now. Marcus Williams from American History, who'd borrowed a pencil from her just yesterday. Now they were all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. "Actually," Lizzie said, her voice carrying farther than she'd intended, "I was wondering about the water quality in this area." The laughter stopped. Christopher's smirk faltered. "What, the water? From the hose?" Lizzie squeezed some from her shirt, watching how it caught the afternoon light. "It has an unusual mineral content, metallic, and there's a slight petroleum odor that shouldn't be present in municipal water." Derek laughed nervously. "What are you, some kind of weird water expert?" "No," Lizzie said, reaching into her backpack. The gas detector was small, about the size of a phone, with a digital display that was currently flashing red. "But this is—" She held it up so everyone could see. The beeping was louder now, more insistent. Several kids stepped back instinctively. "What is that thing?" Sarah Chen asked. "It's a multi-gas detector. It measures methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, oxygen levels. My grandfather used it in coal mines." Lizzie watched Christopher's face as she spoke. The color was draining from it. "Right now, it's detecting elevated levels of several compounds that shouldn't be in the air around a school." "That's impossible," Christopher said quickly. "You're just trying to scare people." "Am I?" Lizzie looked at the reading again. The numbers were climbing. "Because, according to this, we're standing over a significant source of ground contamination. The kind that would happen if, say, industrial waste had been improperly disposed of in this area." The silence stretched out like a held breath. Then Christopher stepped forward, his jaw tight. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Lizzie met his eyes. "Tell me, Christopher, how long has your family lived in Riverside? What's that got to do with anything? Just curious. Because I've been doing some reading about this area. It used to be industrial, didn't it, back in the 80s and 90s? Several chemical companies operated here before the land was sold to the school district." Christopher's hands clenched into fists. "So what? So it's interesting that it was sold so cheaply, almost like someone wanted to get rid of it quickly." Lizzie tilted her head, studying him. "I wonder if they did all the proper environmental testing before they built the school." "You need to shut up." Christopher's voice was low, dangerous. "Or what? You'll hose me down again." Lizzie smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Go ahead. But every time you do, you're just spreading more contaminated water around, and eventually people are going to start asking questions about why the new girl's gas detector keeps going off." That's when Christopher lunged. He moved fast, but Lizzie had been expecting it. Growing up with a father in heavy industry meant growing up around men who solved problems with their fists. She sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and used his momentum to spin him around and down. It was a move her dad had taught her when she was 14. After a supervisor at his old plant had grabbed her arm at a company picnic. Christopher hit the ground hard, and the fire hose went flying. Water sprayed everywhere, creating a muddy mess that sent kids scattering. But Lizzie was already moving, while Christopher rolled on the ground, cursing. She was following the water flow. It was heading toward the drainage grate near the gymnasium, carrying with it that strange shimmer she'd noticed earlier. And her gas detector was going crazy. She knelt by the grate, holding the device just above the opening. The numbers spiked. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, and something else, something organic. Benzene. Her blood went cold. She knew that signature, had seen it in her father's reports. Benzene didn't occur naturally in groundwater. It came from industrial solvents, from petroleum products, from... Get away from there. She looked up, Christopher was standing over her, his shirt torn, his face streaked with mud, but the anger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "I said, get away." "Why?" Lizzie stood slowly, the detector still in her hand. "What's down there?" "Christopher." "Nothing. It's nothing. My grandfather used to tell me about mine disasters," she said conversationally, "how they always started the same way. Someone noticed something wrong, a smell, a sound, a reading on an instrument, and someone else told them it was nothing, right up until the moment the whole mine exploded." Christopher stared at her. In the distance, she could hear teachers approaching, drawn by the commotion. They had maybe 30 seconds before this became an official incident. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "You can't understand. Try me." He looked around wildly, at the dispersing crowd, at the approaching adults, at the drainage grate where contaminated water was still disappearing into the school's foundation. "Not here," he said finally. "Meet me in the library after school. 3rd floor, back corner, and—" he hesitated. "Bring that thing." Then he was walking away, his friends trailing after him, leaving Lizzie standing alone by the grate with her grandfather's detector still screaming warnings in her hands. Ms. Rodriguez, the chemistry teacher, reached her first. "Elizabeth, are you hurt? What happened here?" Lizzie looked down at her soaked clothes, at the detector, at the drainage grate. Then she looked at Ms. Rodriguez, who seemed genuinely concerned, and made a decision. "I slipped," she said. "Hit the fire hose by accident. It's fine." Ms. Rodriguez frowned. "That doesn't explain why half the courtyard is muddy, or why there was shouting. Kids were laughing at me for being clumsy. You know how it is." It wasn't entirely a lie, but as they walked back toward the building, Lizzie caught Ms. Rodriguez glancing at the gas detector in her hand. "What is that device?" "A science project," Lizzie said. "I'm studying air quality for AP Environmental." Another half-truth. She was beginning to realize that surviving Riverside High was going to require a lot of those. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Word had spread about the incident in the courtyard, but the story kept changing. By 6th period, some kids were saying Lizzie had attacked Christopher with a weapon. Others claimed she'd tried to poison the water supply. A few insisted she was working for the EPA, sent to spy on the school. None of them were entirely wrong. As the final bell rang, Lizzie made her way to the library. It was an old building, built long before the main campus, with narrow staircases and creaky floors. The 3rd floor was mostly storage and study alcoves, the kind of place where students went to avoid being found. She found Christopher in the back corner, just as he'd promised. He was alone, sitting at a small table surrounded by tall shelves. He looked different without his audience. Smaller, younger. "You came," he said. "I said I would." She sat across from him, the gas detector on the table between them, this close. She could see the stress lines around his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. "How much do you know?" he asked. "About what? About this place? About what's underneath it?" And Lizzie considered her options. She could play dumb, try to get him to reveal everything, or she could show her cards and hope it led somewhere. "I know the school was built on former industrial land," she said. "I know that land was sold to the district for well below market value. I know that several environmental testing companies submitted reports that were later withdrawn or modified. And I know that Brooks Industrial was the last company to operate on this site before it was sold." Christopher's face went white. How do you know that name? I'm good at research. The question is, why does hearing it make you look like you're going to throw up? He was quiet for a long time. Outside the library windows, the Texas sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty campus. Most of the students had gone home. Soon, even the teachers would be leaving. Finally, Christopher spoke. My father is Richard Brooks. He owns Brooks Industrial. Lizzie nodded. She'd figured that out already. Go on. 23 years ago, this whole area was chemical plants and manufacturing facilities. My father's company was one of them. They made industrial solvents, cleaning compounds, stuff like that. And Christopher's voice dropped to a whisper. When the industry started moving overseas, the companies had a choice. They could pay millions to properly dispose of their chemical waste, or they could cut corners. The cleanup was supposed to cost $47 million. The fine for improper disposal was only $2 million if they got caught, which they probably wouldn't, because this was rural Texas in the 90s. Nobody was paying attention. Lizzie felt sick. So they just buried it. 55,000 drums of industrial waste, benzene, toluene, methylene chloride, acetone, some of it radioactive. They dug trenches, dumped it all in, covered it with dirt and concrete, and then sold the land to build a school. And Christopher nodded miserably. The environmental reports were falsified. The contamination was hidden. And 1,700 kids come here every day, walking over the biggest toxic waste dump in East Texas. The gas detector on the table beeped softly, as if confirming his words. Why are you telling me this? Lizzie asked. Because you already know most of it. And because... He looked at her with eyes that seemed decades older than 17. Because I've been watching kids get sick for 4 years, and I can't take it anymore. Sick how? Headaches, nausea, respiratory problems. The nurse's office is always full. 3 kids have been diagnosed with leukemia since I've been here. The teachers joke about how often they have to step outside for fresh air during class. Lizzie thought about her own symptoms since starting school. The constant, low-grade headache. The way her throat felt scratchy by the end of each day. She'd attributed it to stress, to being the new kid in a hostile environment. How long have you known? I found my father's files when I was 13. Old contracts, disposal manifests, correspondence with the school district. He keeps them in his home office, locked in a filing cabinet. Christopher laughed bitterly. He probably forgot I learned to pick locks in Boy Scouts. So why haven't you said anything? Said anything to who? The principal, he plays golf with my father every weekend. The school board, half of them work for Brooks Industrial. The county health department, they get a generous donation from us every Christmas. What about the state, the EPA? With what proof I'm a kid, the son of the man I'd be accusing? Who's going to believe me? Lizzie stared at him. You're going to let 1,700 kids keep getting poisoned because you're afraid people won't believe you. I'm going to let 1,700 kids keep getting poisoned because, if I speak up, my father goes to prison, my family loses everything, and the contamination gets covered up anyway. You think Brooks Industrial is the only company involved in this? You think my dad acted alone? He leaned forward, his voice urgent. There are 12 companies that dumped waste here. 12. Some of them don't exist anymore. But the ones that do have billions of dollars and teams of lawyers. If this gets out, they'll spend whatever it takes to discredit the evidence, silence the witnesses, and make sure nothing changes. So what? You're just going to keep bullying people to protect your father's secret. I'm going to keep people from asking questions that will get them hurt. Christopher's eyes were hard now. You want to know why I hosed you down today? Because word gets around when the new girl starts asking about environmental testing. Because my father has people watching the school, and they report back to him. Because 3 months ago, a kid named Tommy Martinez started asking similar questions, and now he's in a boarding school in Montana. Lizzie felt ice in her veins. You're saying they threatened a student. I'm saying Tommy Martinez was very interested in why his little sister kept getting nosebleeds during PE class. And I'm saying that, after he started researching groundwater contamination, his father suddenly got a promotion that required relocating the whole family. They sat in silence. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. Soon, the janitors would be making their rounds, locking up for the night. There's something else, Christopher said finally. What? The contamination isn't stable. It's getting worse. The containment barriers they put in 20 years ago are failing. Every heavy rain washes more toxins into the groundwater. Every hot summer causes more vapors to rise through the soil. Lizzie looked at her gas detector. That's why this is going off. That's why your detector is going off in the courtyard, in the gymnasium, in the basement near the cafeteria. The contamination is spreading. And in about 2 years, maybe 3, it's going to reach the municipal water supply, which means 8,000 people are going to be drinking benzene and methylene chloride with their morning coffee. Lizzie closed her eyes. This was bigger than she'd imagined, bigger than a school, bigger than one company's crime. This was an environmental disaster waiting to happen, and the only people who knew about it were too scared or too complicit to act. So what do we do? She asked. Christopher looked at her like she'd lost her mind. There is no we. You're going to transfer to another school. Tonight. Your parents are going to get a very generous job offer in another state, and you're going to take it and never look back. And if I don't, then you'll end up like Tommy Martinez, or worse. Lizzie picked up the gas detector, watching the numbers fluctuate. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, benzene, all the invisible killers her grandfather had taught her to fear. You know what my grandfather used to say about mine disasters? She asked. Christopher shook his head. He said they weren't caused by the gas. They were caused by the silence, by all the people who saw the warning signs and decided it was easier to look the other way. She stood up, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. I'm not looking the other way, Christopher. Lizzie, you don't understand what you're up against. No, she said, heading for the stairs. You don't understand what you're up against. As she walked toward the library exit, her grandfather's detector began beeping again. But this time, she wasn't running from the sound. She was running toward it, because somewhere in this poisoned ground, there had to be evidence, real evidence, the kind that couldn't be buried or bought or intimidated into silence. And she was going to find it, even if it killed her. The question was, would Christopher Brooks help her, or would he try to stop her? Either way, tomorrow was going to be a very different day at Riverside High. The detector beeped once more as she pushed open the library doors, stepping into the darkening Texas evening. In the distance, she could see lights starting to come on across town. 8,000 people, going about their lives, completely unaware of what was seeping up through the ground beneath their feet, but not for much longer, because Elizabeth Morrison had work to do. 3 days later, Lizzie Morrison was crouched behind the gymnasium at 6:30 in the morning, digging a hole with a garden trowel she'd borrowed from the school's maintenance shed. The gas detector clipped to her belt hadn't stopped beeping since she'd arrived on campus. She'd barely slept since her conversation with Christopher in the library. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those numbers on her grandfather's device. Every time she tried to eat, she tasted metal. And every time she walked through the halls of Riverside High, she counted faces. 1,700 students, 1,700 kids who had no idea they were sitting on a chemical time bomb. The soil sample she pulled from the ground was darker than it should be, with an oily consistency that made her stomach turn. She sealed it in a mason jar, labeled it with the date and GPS coordinates, and added it to the growing collection in her backpack. 12 samples now, taken from strategic locations across the campus. All of them contaminated. All of them getting worse. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop! Last warning." She deleted it without responding. It was the fourth threat she'd received since Tuesday. She'd also found her locker vandalized, her car windows soaped, and a dead rabbit in her gym bag. Christopher's friends were getting creative. But Christopher himself had been strangely absent. She'd seen him in the halls, but he'd avoided eye contact, kept his distance, like he was waiting for something. The morning bell rang as she finished collecting her samples. Time for first period chemistry with Ms. Rodriguez. As she walked toward the main building, she noticed something that made her pause. Students were clustered around the gym entrance, their voices excited and worried. "What's going on?" she asked a sophomore she recognized from her English class. "Somebody collapsed during early morning basketball practice," the girl said. "Paramedics are here and everything." Lizzie's blood went cold. She pushed through the crowd until she could see the ambulance, its lights flashing red and blue against the morning sky. EMTs were wheeling someone out on a stretcher. Even from a distance, she could see the oxygen mask covering the student's face. "Who was it?" she asked. "Marcus Williams. He was just running drills, and then he started throwing up and couldn't breathe. Coach says it might be asthma, but Marcus never had asthma before." Lizzie's hands were shaking as she pulled out her gas detector. She held it low, trying to be discreet as she took readings near the gym entrance. The numbers made her sick. Methane levels were through the roof. And something else. Something that hadn't been there before. Carbon monoxide. "Oh God," she whispered. She knew what this meant. The underground contamination wasn't just seeping anymore. It was actively decomposing, creating new toxic compounds. The gym, with its basement-level foundation and poor ventilation, was becoming a death trap. Her phone rang. Unknown number again. "Hello. Meet me in the library. Now." Christopher's voice was tight with panic. "I'm kind of busy. Marcus Williams is my cousin. Meet me in the library or more kids are going to end up in the hospital." The line went dead. 15 minutes later, Lizzie found Christopher in the same back corner where they'd talked before. But this time, he wasn't alone. A woman in her 40s sat beside him, her face drawn with worry. She had the same dark eyes as Christopher, the same strong jawline. "This is my aunt," Christopher said without preamble. "Marcus's mom. I told her everything." The woman looked at Lizzie with a mixture of hope and desperation. "He says you know about the contamination. He says you have proof. I have evidence of groundwater contamination, elevated toxic gas levels, and soil samples that would make an EPA inspector have nightmares," Lizzie said carefully. "But I don't have the kind of proof that would hold up in court." "What would you need? Lizzie glanced at Christopher. His face was pale, but determined, like he'd finally made a decision he'd been avoiding for years. I'd need access to the original disposal records, the real ones, not the falsified versions that were submitted to the state. I'd need documentation showing which companies were involved, what chemicals were buried where, and how long the cover-up has been going on. Christopher's aunt looked at her son. "The files in your father's office." "I can get them," Christopher said quietly. "But once I do, there's no going back. Dad will know it was me. The family will be destroyed. Everyone will hate us." "Everyone already hates us," his aunt said sharply. "We just didn't realize it yet." She turned to Lizzie. "What else do you need?" "Someone with credentials to validate the evidence. A scientist, preferably with EPA connections. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated." "What about Mr. Martinez?" Christopher suggested. "He used to work for the Environmental Protection Agency before he started teaching. He quit because he got tired of politics interfering with environmental protection." Lizzie felt a spark of hope. "Do you think he'd help?" "Let's find out." David Martinez was in his classroom, grading papers when they knocked on his door. He was a small man in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he saw the gas detector in Lizzie's hand, those eyes grew very serious. "I was wondering when someone would start asking questions," he said. "You know about the contamination?" Christopher's aunt asked. "I've suspected for 3 years. The number of students with respiratory problems, the complaints about headaches and nausea, the way test animals in my lab keep getting sick, even though we follow all safety protocols." He looked at Lizzie. "When I heard about your environmental project, I figured you'd either been warned off by now or you'd discovered something significant." "The latter," Lizzie said. She showed him the readings from her gas detector, explained about the soil samples, described what she'd found in the library's historical records. Mr. Martinez listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is much worse than I thought," he said finally. "If you're right about the methane levels, we're looking at potential explosion hazards. And if the contamination is reaching the municipal water supply—" 8,000 people, Christopher said. "At minimum. The aquifer that feeds Riverside also supplies 3 neighboring towns." Martinez pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and made a call. "Jennifer, it's David Martinez. I know it's been 5 years, but I need a favor. I may have found something that requires immediate EPA intervention." "No, I can't discuss it over the phone. How quickly can you get to East Texas?" He hung up and looked at them. "Dr. Jennifer Walsh, EPA Region 6. She'll be here tomorrow morning with a full hazmat team, but we need to give her something concrete to justify the resources." "The files," Christopher said. "I'll get the files tonight." His aunt squeezed his hand. "Are you sure Marcus is in the hospital? Because I was too much of a coward to act 3 years ago. I'm not waiting for someone else to get hurt." That evening, Lizzie sat in her car outside the Brooks family mansion, watching Christopher slip through the shadows toward his father's home office. The house was massive, all columns and manicured lawns, the kind of place built with money that didn't ask too many questions about where it came from. Her phone buzzed with a text. "Got them. Meeting you at the school in 20 minutes. Come alone." 25 minutes later. She found Christopher in Mr. Martinez's classroom, surrounded by boxes of documents. His hands were shaking as he pulled file after file from the containers. "Disposal manifests," he said, holding up a thick folder. 57,000 drums of industrial waste. Benzene, toluene, methyl ethyl ketone, dichloromethane, some of it radioactive, some of it classified as unknown composition. Lizzie felt sick. Unknown composition. Experimental compounds. Chemical weapons research. Stuff that was supposed to be destroyed through proper incineration. But it was cheaper to just bury it. He pulled out another folder. Correspondence between the companies and the school district. They knew. The superintendent, the school board, the county commissioners. They all knew what was buried here when they approved the construction. Why? Lizzie asked. Why would they build a school on a toxic waste dump? Money. The state was offering massive incentives for new school construction in underserved rural areas. The land was cheap because it was contaminated. But nobody wanted to admit that. So they falsified the environmental reports, fast-tracked the approval process, and pocketed the difference. Christopher's voice was bitter. Do you know how much profit they made? $37 million? They built a death trap for 1,700 kids and made $37 million doing it. Lizzie was studying one of the disposal manifests when something caught her attention. Christopher, look at this. Date stamp March 15th, 1992. What about it? The school broke ground in April 1992. They were still dumping chemicals here a month before construction started. Christopher went pale. That means the contamination is directly under the foundation, not just nearby, under it. They worked through the night, cataloging evidence, cross-referencing documents, building a case that even the most corrupt officials couldn't ignore. Dr. Walsh arrived at 7 a.m. with a convoy of EPA vehicles and a team of environmental investigators. She was a tall woman with silver hair and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from decades of dealing with corporate cover-ups. "Show me what you've got," she said. Lizzie led her to the gymnasium first. Dr. Walsh's portable gas analyzer confirmed what Lizzie's detector had been screaming about for days. Methane levels that were approaching explosive concentrations. Hydrogen sulfide that could cause unconsciousness in minutes. Benzene vapors that were linked to leukemia. Jesus Christ, Dr. Walsh muttered. How long has it been like this? Getting worse for months, Mr. Martinez said. But the underlying contamination has been here for over 20 years. Dr. Walsh looked at the school building, at the students arriving for morning classes, at the buses pulling up to discharge more kids. Evacuate, she said. Right now, everyone out. The evacuation took 2 hours. 1,700 students and staff relocated to the community center while EPA investigators swarmed the campus in hazmat suits. Local news crews arrived by noon. State investigators by 2 p.m. Federal prosecutors by evening. Brooks Industrial declared bankruptcy within a month. Other companies involved paid billions in cleanup costs and medical monitoring for anyone who had attended Riverside High or lived in the area. The school itself was demolished, and the land sealed off as a Superfund site. But the victory felt hollow when Lizzie visited him a week after his father's sentencing. 40 years in federal prison, Christopher said. They were sitting by the lake outside town, the same lake that was now being tested for contamination. My whole family is broke. My mom can barely leave the house because of the reporters. My little sister had to transfer schools because kids were throwing rocks at her. I'm sorry, Lizzie said. Are you? Because you got what you wanted? Justice, recognition. You're probably going to get a full scholarship to MIT for environmental science. Lizzie was quiet for a moment. Do you know what my grandfather told me before he died? Christopher shook his head. He said the hardest part of his job wasn't detecting the gas. It was convincing people to act on what he'd found. He said most mine disasters could have been prevented if just one person had been willing to speak up, even when it was inconvenient or expensive or scary. She looked at Christopher. You saved 8,000 people from being poisoned. You saved 1,700 kids from getting cancer. Yes, it cost your family everything. But how do you put a price on that many lives? Christopher was crying now, quiet tears that reflected the afternoon sunlight. I just wish there had been another way. There wasn't. Trust me. I looked for one. 6 months later, Elizabeth Morrison stood before the Texas State Board of Education, presenting her proposal for the Underground Truth Initiative. It was a program that would train high school students to identify environmental hazards at schools built on former industrial sites. Students like her, students like Christopher. There are over 400 schools in Texas built on land that was previously used for industrial purposes, she told the board members. Most underwent environmental testing before construction, but those tests are often inadequate or falsified. We're proposing a network of student environmental monitors, equipped with gas detectors and soil testing kits, who would conduct ongoing safety assessments. The program was approved unanimously. Christopher Brooks was the first volunteer. Despite everything his family had lost, despite the hatred and threats and financial ruin, he'd decided to spend his life making sure what happened at Riverside High never happened again. My father destroyed a lot of lives, he told Lizzie as they prepared for their first training session, including his own, but maybe we can save some. The Underground Truth Initiative now operates in 12 states, has identified contamination at 37 schools, and has prevented countless cases of environmental illness. It's run by students, for students, because sometimes the most dangerous toxins are the ones adults have decided to ignore. And in East Texas, where Riverside High used to stand, there's now a memorial garden. It's built on clean soil, transported from outside the contamination zone. The plaque reads, "In memory of all those sickened by preventable environmental disasters, and in honor of those brave enough to speak truth to power." Elizabeth Morrison visits that garden every year on the anniversary of the evacuation. She brings her grandfather's gas detector, though it's no longer needed. The air is clean now, but she keeps it close anyway. Because the most dangerous things in this world are still the ones you can't see. And someone always needs to be watching. 5 years later, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison stood in her EPA laboratory in Washington, D.C., analyzing soil samples from a suspicious construction site in Montana. Her grandfather's gas detector sat on her desk, still functional, still ready. She'd never stopped carrying it. Her phone rang. Christopher Brooks, now a senior at Texas A&M studying environmental law. "You need to see the news," he said. "Channel 7 just broke a story about contamination at 3 schools in Oklahoma. Industrial waste from the 1980s. Sound familiar?" Lizzie pulled up the news feed on her computer. Sure enough, there it was. Student environmental monitors from the Underground Truth Initiative had detected elevated toxin levels at schools in Tulsa, Norman, and Stillwater, all built on former industrial sites, all hiding the same deadly secret that Riverside High had carried for decades. "How many kids this time?" she asked. 8,000, across all 3 schools, but they're being evacuated today instead of next year, or next decade. Lizzie smiled. "Your father's in prison, but somewhere. 8,000 kids are going home healthy tonight because you found the courage to break his silence." "We found the courage," Christopher corrected. "And we're not done yet." Through her office window, Lizzie could see the Capitol dome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Tomorrow, she'd testify before Congress about proposed legislation requiring environmental monitors at all schools built on former industrial sites. The Underground Truth Initiative was becoming federal policy. Her grandfather would have been proud. The detector on her desk beeped softly, just a calibration check. But it reminded her that somewhere, invisible dangers still lurked in the ground, in the air, in the water, and somewhere. Young voices were rising to expose them. The truth, it turned out, was louder than any cover-up, and it echoed forever.